Ladies and gentlemen, the most amazing discovery in the Bible of all time. I know you guys have been watching for a while here at Myth Vision. You've been watching me host a lot of people. Well, today my co-host, who helped me create Myth Vision podcast, Dr. Luther G. Williams, will be interviewed by me. And Dr. Luther G. Williams has been studying this stuff for a very, very long time. He's going to look at the scriptures, the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures, all the above, in a totally different way. I'm not sure if you've ever looked at them this way. I'm not sure if you've ever even thought of them like this. So get ready to put on a new pair of glasses and consider looking at these things in a deeper sense, in an esoteric way, and something that might have slipped your eye, the naked eye, the first time you read through. Hope you guys like this podcast. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. And don't forget to show our brother Luther some love as he's editing this book. He says that if you donate and help him out, he'll put your name in the book. Love you guys. We are Myth Vision, the most amazing discovery in the Bible of all time, with Dr. Luther G. Williams. Dr. Luther G. Williams is a social psychologist, and his academic research focuses on music as a form of communication. He served as an audience research consultant for many mass media outlets, is an avid Bible researcher, as well as the history as we know it. He has a keen eye for the esoterics of the Bible and pattern recognition. He has published his research for 25 years. Dr. Luther joined me in this quest and has opened my eyes to many secrets that the naked eye usually misses when researching these stories in the Bible. He is the founder of the field of theoacoustics and the pioneer of esoteric fulfilled eschatology, or preterism as we know it. He is one of the creators of the show Myth Vision podcast. Give him a warm welcome. And here we are, Dr. Luther G. Williams. How you doing, my brother?
It's wonderful, my brother, to join you on the show. You know, you've been doing a great job, and that deserves to be lionized. You've had all these wonderful guests on, some of which I've been on the show with you, and just keep up the marvelous work. You know, I've been missing in action working on this book, and so we get to talk a little bit about it. And I came on the show today because I figure I owe the many people who have contributed in one way or another, all of the Myth Vision fans and those who have wished me well, those who have made financial contributions, you know, to this book, which is going to be released in the summer. By the way, we're going to talk just a little bit about it as a teaser to let you know what I've been up to for the last 6 months or so.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing from you on this because we've talked for years, Luther. I mean, and when we honestly, I'm just going to say, when we don't give a shit, all right, and I'm going to put it point blank because you know how I am. When we don't give a shit about people watching and looking and what they think, and we just are you and me being who we are, that's when we get like to the best content. Some of the ideas that you and me bring forward, and we bounce off each other. I like to look at it as you like to be the machine that really puts this stuff together, and I might poke in as the brain who has a thought and just says, what do you think of that? And you go, oh my gosh, that's a good point. And then we wrestle with these ideas. So Dr. Luther, what is it that you're going to bring to us today that is the secret? It's the greatest discovery.
Yeah, I intended that title as kind of a teaser, but essentially what we're talking about is the potential energy of not having studied what we're talking about today, and that is the esoterics of the scriptures, onomatology, shemology, gematria. And as you refrain from studying these things for hundreds and even thousands of years, and you pull that slingshot back, there's a tremendous amount of potential energy that's built up, so that when you begin to release it in publications, as I'm doing right now, it snaps back and you realize, oh my God, this has been part of the scriptures all along. We need to talk about this. And so my quest has been to find an honorable place for esoteric research in the scholarship of the day. All of the fields that I mentioned are worth studying, but the key to it is not to look upon them as isolated discoveries, which has been the history of esoterics so far, but to tie them to theoretical perspectives. And this is what makes this research unique. When you're talking about, for example, Second Temple Judaism, and in contrast with the First Temple that Margaret Barker was doing? And what can esoterics do to enlighten that study? When we talk about politics of the Maccabean Revolt, which we'll discuss a lot today, functional theory of Genesis, John Walton has that, and esoterics can shed a great deal of light on that. The Adam is Israel theory, which is really more like a short-range hypothesis of Peter Enns and N.T. Wright, Seth Postel, and others. Esoterics illuminates that study. And most importantly, I think the listeners will and viewers will find most interesting Roman provenance theory. And so we've, in studying all of this, Derek, you've suffered accusations, as have I, on occasion, that, hey, you guys are skipping all around and you seem to change different research perspectives. What are you doing? Why don't you stick with one thing? What the viewers have to realize, and what I'm sure you do already, is that you can only answer certain kinds of questions to yield certain kinds of information, and that you have to ask other sorts of questions to get at other types of information. And so when we're talking about the what questions in mythicism, okay, we can describe the mystery schools, we can describe the various mythical systems that were in play around the first century. That's fine, but it really doesn't give an insight into the political motivations. The political motivations are just now coming into focus. And so we have to ask different kinds of questions to get at the why of all of this. For example, the work of Bruno Bauer, a scholar who we can actually trace the beginning of Roman provenance theory in the modern world to his work in the 1800s. Well, only one of his works, to my knowledge, has been translated and really studied, The Christ of the Caesars. And so unless we go back to examining his work, translating more of it, and taking a serious look at the political motivations behind the writing of the latter parts of the Old Testament and the New Testament, we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle, which has tremendous explanatory value. And so esoterics gets at that, as we shall see. And so I'd like you to ask Dr. Bob, when you have him next on the show, about projects to translate more of Bruno Bauer's work. We desperately need it. And Roman provenance theory cannot be complete without it. But anyway, I'm just saying that esoterics touches upon all of these different areas and these research methods. It's just like wanting to know about people's television habits. If you want to know their incidents and how often you watch a show, you ask them. A survey would get at that. If you want to know something about their satisfactions, then you say, well, what do you get from the experience? And so you go a little deeper in asking those questions. If you want to know about the constellation of events and the milieu that's present when people are watching television or listening to the radio or going to concerts, then maybe you'd want to do an ethnographic study or get them around in a focus group. You have to acknowledge different methods to get at the kinds of questions that I think are profitable in this kind of research. And that's what esoterics has not done in the 2 centuries or so that we've been doing this seriously, and what I'm beginning to do and what I hope to accomplish.
Well, now that we've got a great introduction to what you're doing and things that you're interested in looking at, because I'm a big fan of it as well. I mean, as much as people don't recognize it, they might listen to what you just said and go, I'm not into this. Well, you must not be into things that other scholars are into either, because all of these major scholars play a part and utilize some of the things you're talking about, but they throw away all the others. And for example, the Shemology, okay? These people recognize that names, for example, there's some strange, it doesn't make sense historically to title the person's name behind the very action that they actually do according to the narrative. And so it's kind of like it's like Derek. My name's Derek, and it means the path in Hebrew, which is the way. Okay,
path or road.
Right. It's like, imagine I'm literally being named Derek, and everyone is supposed to follow me in the narrative to a certain place. Well, that kind of plays its role. Was I really named Derek? Now, at this point, you have to go, was there really a guy named historically Derek that actually played perfectly into the narrative, who actually led these people on a road to a certain place? His name means the very thing he does. So lots of scholars see that, but the scholars aren't seeing gematria. The scholars aren't seeing the pattern recognition that you're trying to look at. You're looking at the fabric the development and fabric nature of the authors here, who most likely are mystery schools that are trained in knowing how to use these things. So let's go into some examples, Dr. Luther, that can get our audience acquainted with this amazing teaching that a lot of people have no clue about.
All right, well, let's talk about, first of all, proper names. Some of the things that I get into in the book. Let's say your name, Derek, that has a certain numerical value based upon its letters. I might say that Derek not only means road or path, but there's a numerical value that is associated with the name based upon the value of the particular letters that make it up. And the theory of gematria is quite simply that the numerical value of different words are related, so that we not only have the meanings and the phonemes that are related to each other, but also we can transfer the numerical values in order to recognize the similarity of meanings between certain words and phrases. So let's say, just as an example, I don't know the numerical value of Derek. I haven't computed it. I could do that in English. But let's say 318. If the numerical value of Derek is, let's say, 318. And I wanted to do a story, and I wanted to somehow impart the idea of the road or the path in a character of my own creation in a book, let's say a New Testament book, to take an example. Well, then I might create a character whose numerical value, whose name would also be 318. It wouldn't be Derek, but it would be another one.
Right.
And then, of course, the association would be very clear. Well, this is the kind of thing that was done in the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And there are primarily three sources of the types of names that we see and the significance of these names in the formation of what they became in the New Testament. And they are, first of all, the experience of the Jews, including their political experiences. Primarily Maccabean times. I do a lot of work with the Maccabeans because I'm beginning to think that much of Christianity is a footnote to Maccabean times. I want to talk a lot about the revolt of the Maccabeans in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. So it's the Jews' experiences is one source. Another source is Greek mythology. From the Orphic schools, we learned that the names of gods were significant not only for what they meant, but also for their numerical value. They were chosen, they were constructed in order to represent a particular numerical value. And then the most important source, I think, is the mythology of the Hebrews, which borrows from those other two sources that I mentioned. And in their mythology, you have people such as Moses. Okay, what's the numerical value of the name Moses? We have Ramses, who is thought by some scholars to be the Pharaoh of the Exodus. What is the significance of his role? Abraham, as you said, all very important in terms of the numerical value and how they are expressed and how this value was carried forward in the New Testament, how it was extended and interpreted, and in how it was used ultimately. So, I mean, for example, you wanted an example, so I'll give you one quick example. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's take an incident that's seldom remarked in connection with the Maccabean revolt. In fact, it precedes the Maccabean revolt by about 10 years, and that is the Heliodorus incident. Heliodorus means gift of the sun. And he was an official right after the reign of Antiochus III, the Seleucid king, and he worked with Seleucus IV, who was the predecessor of Antiochus IV. We all know about Antiochus Epiphanes, and we know about his persecution of the Jews during the Maccabean revolt. But you don't hear a lot about the Heliodorus incident. And so Heliodorus, on orders from Seleucus IV, went into the Jewish temple in order to confiscate the treasury. And according to 2 Maccabees chapter 3, a miraculous incident happened in which he saw a vision of a rider on a horse and young men, and the horse brayed and the horse reared up and attacked him, and he was rendered practically unconscious as far as we could tell. Onias III, who was in charge of the temple, the high priest, prayed for him. He was restored. And so this incident, even though it may not be factual, what the writers are saying in the 2nd Maccabees and 1st Maccabees as well, they're saying that there was this common set of experiences that helped to cement the relationship between the Seleucids and the Jews. And so we see that behind it in the Heliodorus incident. Well, what's important here, one of the things that we often miss, is that the numerical value of Heliodorus is 1290. If we look at the Kola value, which means the approximate numerical value, because it can be off by 1 or 2, and you'll find that it's either 1 or 2 less or 1 or 2 more, and we'll talk about how this works. But the numerical value is 1290. Well, that features prominently in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 12, verse 11 talks about the 1290 days in connection with the pollution of the temple. And it says that from the failure to recognize the daily sacrifice, not really failure, but it's God's decision not to recognize that sacrifice, to the abomination of desolation shall be 1290 days. So it figures prominently. Well, not only does Heliodorus figure prominently in that scheme, but also the gods whom Heliodorus believed in and represented. Heliodorus means gift of the sun. The numerical value of the sun is 1290, and Heliodorus is 1290. And then we look at the sun, which is placed in the heavens. So in Greek mythology, Uranos, the god Uranos, a form of his name, 1290. Uranus had a son named Kronos. The numerical value of a form of Kronos is 1290. Kronos had a son named Poseidon. I'm into the Greek mythology now. The numerical value of a form of Poseidon is 1290. So we can see how this was appropriated by the Jews, by a particular group called the Maskelim, the wise ones, who are attributed with writing Daniel in the mid-2nd century, and how this is important to the telling of the entire story, interwoven in the politics of the time, in the relations between the Seleucids and the Jews, and was carried forward into the New Testament.
So Luther, my theory, and I don't want to get too far off, I actually suspect the New Testament audience, or the authors, I mean, are actually borrowing from such a group, at the very least, if not their descendants from this group. It's like a passed on tradition, because from what I have been looking at is you have the break between the Proto-Masoretic text and you have the OG, the original Greek, or LXX, which had various offshoots, and then you had the Pentateuch of the Samaritans and whatnot. But my point is down here in the Septuagint, or this Hellenized version, these guys seem to be in that vein. And somehow down here into the New Testament, we see a continuity here. But I don't want to sidetrack on that. I love what you did with the numbers. Can we take what you're doing with the Greek mythology, showing that the politics are here? There's a Hellenized, with these wise ones, Hellenized Jewish version of these wise ones here, and bring it into the New Testament. Give us some examples. You brought up Daniel and you said 1290. This theme goes into the New Testament. You brought up names and you say a form of. I think it's important that we show people real quick who are skeptics, because most of our people watching are skeptics, that they purposely would spell names on purpose to match the numerical values. And that's a huge red flag on why your system of thought seems to make more sense.
Right. Well, there are certain red flags that alert us to the possibility that numerical values are important in the text. And let's talk about a few of those factors. First of all, the presence of numbers actually in the text. If we look at, for example, Exodus chapter 12, verses 41 to 42, and it talks about 430 years that Israel was captive in Egypt. Okay, that's listed right there in the text. And when a number's in the text, that's saying this is important, you better pay attention to it. So just the presence of numbers in the text is one thing that alerts us that something may be going on. Another example would be the 38 years of the man in John 5 who's at the sheep gate. And every time you see a number that's mentioned like that in the text, particularly in the New Testament, it is the basis for a pattern of gematria and for the exposition of concepts that are used in relation to that figure.
Dr. Luther, example, real quick, I was going to say this is so important. I love this because someone is going to comment. There's plenty of people out here who are going to go, it's just a number. You're just making things up. I can't wait to see where you take us here, because I think this is important. I can already hear the trolls screaming in the comments section. So please take us down this path.
Well, not only is it not just a number, it wasn't even a number back in the way it was used by the original scribes, because numbers had a numerological significance from the very beginning. They were used first numerologically and then quantitatively. We think today of, okay, 430, well, that's just 400s and then add 30. No. These things had spiritual significance, they had numerical significance, and numbers were always used in these Mediterranean cultures to represent spiritual truths. For example, as the seasons of the year were delineated, it was noted that you had an agricultural season that consisted of 7 months. So you had 7 months, or you had a big 7 in order to do something. You fall outside of that 7 into the winter months and everything is dead. So 7 became very important. But not only those lower order numbers where you have just numbers of small magnitude, but higher order numbers. For example, 70, you add a 0 to it. And there we have the magnification and the amplification of 7. Not only that, let's look at 700, let's look at 7,000. And all of those things are magnifications of the original numbers. So all of these numbers have a numerical significance that is documented. And so I'm going to give you an example of that. I started talking about 430. That's a good example, okay?
Yeah, please.
So, okay, so the presence of a number in the text tells us that something may be going on. Well, Derek, what do you say when the number is mentioned twice? Why? Exodus chapter 12, verses 41 and 42. Okay, the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. Yes, it was 430 years to the day, the next verse says, that they were there. Really? Well, what's that supposed to mean? Okay. Well, let's go over to Numbers chapter 33 and verse 3, and it lists the city from which Israel departed Egypt. That city is Ramses. Ramses. The numerical value of Ramses is 430. Okay, so let's get this straight. They left after 430 years. You're saying it twice. And the city they left from is Ramses, which has a numerical value in Hebrew of 430. Okay. What might be the concept behind this? I mean, that in itself is a clue that something important is going on here. Well, let's take it a little further. Where else does the Bible specifically mention 430? It mentions it in Genesis chapter 11 in connection with an antediluvian patriarch named Eber. And Eber had 2 sons. He had a son named Joktan, and he had a son named Peleg, whose name means division. Now that's in the text of Genesis 10. Okay, you read a little further in these genealogies, and again, what do you get out of genealogies? What were they after? I'm not going to endlessly read that this one begat this one, and all these years and all of that. What are we supposed to get from that? Well, I'll give you a clue as to what you're supposed to get from that. Eber had this son named Peleg, whose name means division. Now you go over one chapter in Genesis chapter 11, verse 25, and it says that after Eber had this son whose name was division, he lived 430 years. Okay, so now 430 is associated with the concept of division. Well, that's funny. In Exodus, it's also associated with the concept of division because Israel left Egypt after 430 years, and you said it twice. So then you take this concept of division because you feel you may be onto something or may not be onto something. You've got to test a wide variety of examples here. And you test examples from the Old and the New Testaments on the concept of division. So you go everywhere in the Bible where the concept of division is present, and you see, are there statistical anomalies in which this concept is represented by the number 430? Perhaps in the gematria. It's not stated anywhere else in the scripture. So you test the gematria. So get out your calculator and see if there's something to 430 representing division. And you find that it's all over. Not only Psalm 78, I believe it says, God, you did divide the Red Sea, the dividing of the Red Sea, 430. Who was the great lawgiver who oversaw the division of Israel as their people came out of Egypt. It was Moses, numerical value of Moses, 430. I mean, the concept is all over. You look at division in its many guises in the New Testament, multiples of 430. Now, is 430 always representing division? And are there other numbers that could represent this concept of division or be related to it? The answer is certainly yes, in the sense that a train, Train, is not always the lengthy part of a woman's garment. But that doesn't mean that it never is. So she wears a train. Does it mean that she has a caboose and she has an engine? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that it is significant to the degree that we need to pay attention to it in certain contexts. And as you learn to recognize these contexts and you build them into the body of research, a picture begins to form. And that is what we are looking at. And this picture is immensely important to the story of the Old and New Testaments.
Something that always caught my attention, Dr. Luther, that I found fascinating and that you really pointed out to me real briefly, and then we can maybe get into a few other examples, I feel, and this goes into some of the older research, not even into when you were into the politics of these things. Adam, the numeric value of Adam, and then taking it straight to Jesus in the gospel narrative. Can you give us that story quickly?
Yeah, I will. This is one of my early observations. The story of Jesus speaking with the Pharisees in John chapter 2. And here he's having a conversation with them, and he says, "Destroy this temple, and I'll raise it in 3 days." Okay, John is a very mystical, esoteric gospel. Of course, it talks about the Logos, and we know about the influence that Philo had on this concept of the Logos. And so here in John chapter 2, he's having this conversation with the Pharisees, and they react to his statement that I'm going to destroy this temple in 3 days. And they say, "What do you mean? It took us 46 years to build the temple." 46 years to build the temple. So I'm thinking one of the things I'm going to do is examine the Greek text where that is stated. And sure enough, 46 years in building the temple, a multiple of 46. All right. Also, the temple, and this is part of basic mysticism, is not only a what, but it is a who, in the sense that people are the habitation of God in Jewish theology. And so we find that Jesus, as the new Adam, 1 Corinthians 15, is an expression of the original concept of Adam as the temple. And the numerical value of Adam, well, let's look at that. Adam would be alpha, delta, alpha, mu. The numerical value of alpha is 1. The numerical value of delta is 4. The numerical value of the second alpha is 1, as we just said. And the numerical value of mu is 40. 1 plus 4 plus 1 plus 40 equals 46. Now, what's interesting in all this is that, okay, it took us 46 years to build the temple. But the temple is not only a what, it is a who, and it is Adam. It is both the second Adam and the first Adam. And so we find all these references to the temple turn out to be multiples of 46. Now, what was the temple in the days of Hebraic Judaism in Old Testament days? Well, it was the province of a tribe called the Levites. The Levites were the descendants of a patriarch called Levi. And the numerical value of his name in Hebrew, Lamed, Vav, Yod. The numerical value of Lamed is 30. The numerical value of Vav is 6. The numerical value of Yod is 10. 30 plus 6 plus 10 is, again, 46. Why? The Levites were in charge of the temple. And in John chapter 2, we find again the discussion between Jesus and the Pharisees centers on the temple. So we have this assemblage of concepts that were important throughout all of Judaism, but they're resonating afresh in the New Testament. But there's something else that's going on here. Because remember now, you cannot divorce it from the politics, Derek. And so the Levites were again important in New Testament theology because they were revived in Maccabean times. It was a Levitical priest by the name of Mattathias who in the small village of Modin touched off the Maccabean revolt. And everything we see in the New Testament is kind of a response or kind of an answer to the political dynamics in the Maccabean revolt, including this revival of Levi. They were very conscious that the Jews of New Testament times were the new Levites of that era. So yeah, they brought in all these Levitical themes. At the same time that Daniel was written, First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, you also had the Testament of Levi, which was the most popular of the works called the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. And in it, it talked about Levi, and it was a revival of these Levitical themes. Now, this is seen in the book of Hebrews, which once again hammers on Levitical themes. You know as well as I do that the book of Hebrews talks a lot about contrasting the Melchizedekan priesthood with the what? Levitical priesthood, and that was written within the political context of the Jews being ousted from Rome under Claudius. So you see how the numerics is intertwined inextricably with the political realities of the day.
Yes, and this is what your book's going to be focused on so much. Everyone is watching. We're going to make sure that this is out there for them to get. You know, something that becomes obvious to me. For example, most people who watch a show obviously recognize the gospel narrative is fictional and or historical fiction at best. Okay. This catching fish with the net, for example, we've heard this explained in other places, 153 fish. There's the numbers again, but and that's obvious. Oh, well, that's Pythagorean, or that's a triangular number. You know, we can go into that, but that's a side trail I think is worthy for its own episode. Dr. Luther, what other examples would you like to give delving into the numerics and how this has its connections politically, maybe into Daniel? Because you talk about 1335 a lot as well. But I wanted to ask you, in light of that.
I can't wait to talk about 1335 because it is the, if you will, the hero number of Maccabean times, of the book of Daniel, 1st and 2nd Maccabees.
Are you able to go into John the Baptist with that number? Because I remember there's a way that they spell these names on purpose that, in my opinion, gives for a skeptic, right? If I was like looking for something, you've tampered with this because John is not spelled that way in the other synoptics or something to that effect.
Right. Well, John the Baptist has been talked about by your other guests in mythological terms. I remember when we had Phil on the show, and he talked about John the Baptist as being a reflection of Oana, the Babylonian goddess, and all of that is true, but there's so many layers to this. Let's talk about John the Baptist, kind of focus on that, and I think that'll be a touchstone for some other things that we might discuss.
Okay.
John the Baptist, or as I like to call him, John the Baptizer, his name can be spelled various ways. What's interesting about John, what I find most interesting, is that one of the common spellings of his name is 969. Anybody who knows anything about Bible numerics knows that 969 is a tremendously important number because it describes the lifespan of the oldest patriarch in the days of Adam, of the descendants of Adam, and that is Methuselah. Methuselah lived 969 years. You'll find that at the end of Genesis chapter 5. But what's more important here is the message of Methuselah, which was appropriated in New Testament times, and that is, it's found in the meaning of the name. So here we get into a nomatology. Methuselah means, when he is dead, it shall be sent, or his death shall bring. You can translate it along those lines. Okay. How is that important with respect to John the Baptist? When he is dead, it shall be sent. John the Baptist opened the door for Jesus's ministry, such that when John died, Jesus came into prominence. So we can say John was a Methuselah figure in the sense that when he is dead, it, whatever you want to call it, the biggie, the main movement here, shall be sent. Numerical value of John, 969. But what's interesting here is that John the Baptist had kind of an opposite figure, an oppositional figure. We know that he was the nemesis of Herod Antipas. Herod is also spelled 969. So we have on the one hand, John, and we have his enemy, Herod, both spelled 969. So go to another spelling of John. Let's say, take another case in the Greek or somewhere where John is spelled in a different way. And I'm not sure about the value here, but I believe it's 1119. I think the numerical value of John, if memory serves, is 1119. But what's interesting, and this I am sure of, is that another spelling of Herod is also 1119. So they're paired twice. So one of the messages is when you're contemplating the meaning of John the Baptist, do it in relation to Herod. We're presenting two characters here, and you need to study them together. It's the relationship between John the Baptizer and Herod that is the focus here. All right, well, the numerics keys us into this, but it's not limited to numerics. And here's the reason why. The function of John was to baptize. And many scholars have noted that John is, in this sense, the water bearer. Well, we have a sign of the zodiac, which from antiquity, from the days of the Babylonians, who gave us the modern zodiac, closest to the way we understand it today, recognize this as the sign of Aquarius. So we say John is the Aquarius, if you will, of the biblical story. It makes sense. He's the water bearer. Herod would be his opposite. And on the zodiacal wheel, if you look at the signs of the zodiac, opposite Aquarius is Leo the lion. Leo is the hero of the zodiac. He's the triumphant hero, which at the height of summer represents the sun burning brightly. Well, wouldn't you know that the name Herod means hero? And so, yes, just as John is associated with Aquarius, the water bearer, Herod is associated with Leo the lion. And we find not only these numbers, 969 and 1119, as I recall, being associated with both John the Baptist and Herod, but we also find a much more important number, which is 1380 being associated again with both figures. You look at the account of the beheading of John the Baptist. It is full of this pattern of 1380, both in connection with Herod and in connection with John the Baptist. Well, what are we talking about here? Well, the numerical value of the word beheaded from Revelation chapter 20 is 1380. And it was Herod who beheaded 1380 John. And the numerical value of Herod is 1380, and the numerical value of John is 1380. And so there is a clue here as to how these things are being used. But again, I keep bringing it back to the politics, that John and Herod were on opposite sides of the political spectrum that Dr. Eisenman and Chris Lawson and Joe Atwell and Daniel Unterbrink talk about. And that is that the major divide in early New Testament times was pro-Roman, anti-Roman. This cut across all sects, it cut across all philosophies, it cut across all schools. So what we have portrayed by the numbers is an anti-Roman contingent and a pro-Roman contingent. And those who designed the Bible keyed in the numbers to represent these political realities. I know I'm going over a lot here, but
you definitely
we'll come back to it.
This is good. This is good. Okay, so that was something that fascinated me back in the day. I was still a believer when I heard these numbers, and I said, me and you were talking, and I was like, holy moly, this proves not only did God have the story historically line up, because I took a real fundamentalist approach.
Right.
The numbers even match the narrative, and I didn't get it. Well, now
Right.
I'm seeing what you're seeing in terms of patterns and seeing this as an actually well thought out and well written, if you will, mythology, so to speak. I guess you put that in the narrative of some type of mythological celestial allegory, because these numbers 138 you keep talking about, they don't just hold true here on here in terms of things on the ground, but these magi, for example, all right, the idea of, and I know I'm jumping around and I'm not trying to say this, the magi equate to everyone who authored these books, but what I am trying to say is
Right.
there is some type of celestial, like what you said with the zodiac, numerical value of 138 playing a role. Does it not play a role in terms of trying to observe the stars and some significant with celestial or heavenly bodies?
We haven't begun yet to explore the significance of this 138 or this 1380. There are various lines of discussion which are suggested by the extant research so far, some of which I've pursued. There's one particular researcher that has looked at the angles of the stars in relation to the Earth and has found that an angle of 138 degrees of the North Star directly due north, 130 degrees off from that represents the dog star, the star that controlled the flooding of the Nile, which is a tremendously important star. It figures prominently in celestial portrayals in the Bible. Paul's voyages, for example, in Acts chapter 27 and 28. And so we find that these things describe not only gematria, but they also describe the angles of the stars, the celestial bodies. These things are tied in ways we can't imagine yet. But I want to key in again on this. The politics, I guess, runs through much of what we're saying here, and we're talking about the opposite of John the Baptist and Herod the Great, and them being diametrically opposed. Okay, if they are diametrically opposed, one of the first questions you're going to ask is, what are the other diametric pairs that describe the zodiacal wheel? So you have Aquarius and Leo. But if you rotate that diametricity, then you'll find that each sign also has its opposites. And one of the premier thrusts of the book is this idea that the authors of the New Testament portrayed half the zodiac as pro-Roman and the other half of the zodiac as anti-Roman. And that's a teaser. There's lots more that I could talk about in relation with this. But when you take the zodiac itself and you assign to these various zodiacal figures pro-Roman and anti-Roman identities, it's saying something very special. Then you refract it upon the names of the disciples themselves. And I want to ask you a question, Derek.
Yeah.
Were the disciples real, or were they just representations of the zodiac? Were any of the disciples real, or were they simply reflections of the zodiac? Let me tell you why. I'll give you a reason why I think that this might be the case, that they're reflections of the zodiac, at least as a group, if not by their individual names as a group. You look at Matthew chapter 10, right? Verse 2. All right, all over the internet, there's been the proposal that the 12 disciples are the signs of the zodiac. There's much research that points that out. Akaria S. Pointed this out. We have artifacts, we have lamps, we have the testimony of early Christian fathers. We have Pope Leo the Great, who said so himself, and many scholars over the years, observers, historians, have attested that the 12 disciples are the signs of the zodiac. Well, I'm a skeptic, so I'm not really convinced. So I got to look at this afresh. So what I do is I take it to be the subject of an onomatological analysis, and I look at the names of the 12 disciples in their basic lists. Matthew chapter 10, verse 2. Verses 2 and 3 talks about the names of these disciples. Well, it turns out that the names of these disciples describe in perfect order the signs of the zodiac. So you got the whole list of disciples that represent, I mean, you go right across. I mean, Bartholomew is listed, for example. And I'm looking at Bartholomew. Bartholomew means son of the furrows. That's an onomatological analysis. What animal was used to create furrows in agriculture in the ancient year? It was the ox, okay? Could it be that Bartholomew is Taurus the bull? Well, if he is Taurus the bull, then who's next to him? Well, next to him is the disciple Thomas. Okay, what does Thomas mean? Well, he had two names, Thomas Didymus. Both those names mean twin. It just so happens that Gemini is right next to Taurus. Okay, and Thomas is right next to Bartholomew. So the next disciple listed, according to that list in Matthew chapter 10, verse 2, would be Matthew. Okay, who might he represent? Could he be Cancer the crab? After all, that's the next zodiacal sign. Well, the interesting thing about Matthew is that he was the only disciple who was discovered while sitting. The New Testament says that Jesus found him sitting at the tax collection office. Well, wouldn't you know that the sign of Cancer the crab sits at the summer solstice for 3 days in which the sun doesn't move? It's the highest point that the sun reaches in the summer, and it stays there for 3 days before changing direction and going down into the winter months. Okay, so that's an example of 3 disciples right together, and I could do that with all 12 disciples. So were any of them real? We just looked at this seemingly artificial diametricity between Leo and Aquarius, between John the Baptist and Herod, and now we're lining it up with each of the disciples in turn, and it lines up perfect, 100%. So I say to you again, how much of this is real? As a skeptic, it makes more sense for me to look at this in terms of the zodiac than it does for me to treat these as real people.
Well, you bring up some very good points, Dr. Luther, and that's one of the huge questions I have, right, is probing into the question of historicity, not just Jesus, okay, like any of this. I'm at a point now where it's like, okay, we're not just talking about Jesus, because what you do when you hear apologetics, right, and this, I'm just speaking on the Christian side, though there are non-Christians who argue for the historicity of Jesus or characters. One of the issues I find is that they'll say stuff like John the Baptist was a real person in real history. We have other sources that say he was. However, Jesus is somehow found in the narrative next to a really living person that actually existed. Or Pontius Pilate, for example, he actually existed. And so they make this apologetic argument to say that means Jesus exists. And here's my problem. Paul Bunyan was born in Maine, okay, according to the narrative, with the blue ox. Paul Bunyan, from what I've seen, did not actually exist, though he was born in Maine and he became a lumberjack, and he supposedly had 12 or something like 10, 12 cows just for milk that he had to milk just for his breakfast. That's not counting the stacks of pancakes or the earthquakes he caused as a little boy when he would walk and cause it's very folklore, it's legend, it's not literal. And so I'm wrestling with that same question you have. And one of the last things I wanted to touch on with this, Dr. Luther, in light of all of this, are these people real? Is this really, are the 12 disciples real? Is Jesus real? We love talking about this question because we aren't absolutely certain. How much of this is theology? How is there bone beneath all the fabrication, all the myth, all the legend, all the great storytelling? Is there a bone? And if there is, like Dr. Price said in a debate he had back in the early 2000s, was if there was a Christ Jesus in the back of the Gospels, he says, we know nothing of him. We really don't know anything actually about him. So I want to ask you something. I asked this to Dr. Bob. I don't think he acknowledged it because he says, well, we got to take each gospel at a time specifically, and I agree with that. Adam. Adam's put into a deep sleep. A bride is made from his side. This question got brought up. I tagged you in it on the Facebook group, Mythical Jesus versus Historical Jesus, but they talked about the 6th hour. And crucifixion, it's rare in the real sense, in the real world, that anyone would die only after 6 hours of being hung like that, when everyone else took days or even a week to die. And Pontius Pilate, according to the narrative, is freaking out, like, how did he die so quick? And this is where it gave rise to the theory of the theory that Dr. Bob mentioned, was that they gave him drink of some type of either medicine or something, and they pretended for him to die. And John comes in and tries to poke him in the side and make sure he's dead, but the other gospels don't have a Roman soldier do that. So I personally looked at this and analyzed this in my mind and said, there are 3 times people were put into a deep sleep, from I can tell. It obviously tells us Adam and Abraham put into a deep sleep. God made a covenant with him. With Adam, it was a bride. And with Abraham, he passes through the split animals, and he created a eternal covenant with him that he'd be the father of many nations. And if he doesn't keep his part, God split asunder. Well, with Jesus, from what I understand, on the cross, crucifixion, according to the gospel narrative, he also went into a deep sleep. He gave up the ghost, whatever. He ends up in a deep sleep. And out of his side, just like Adam, God makes a bride, a church. Okay, the idea from his side. That narrative made me think even the death of Jesus, though people were crucified in real history, the death of Jesus itself seems fictitious. It seems allegorical. It seems somehow not literal, though there were people who were dying of crucifixion during the war, and Josephus accounts of these things. My thing is, right here, this seems like a esoteric spin on things that they witnessed around them. What do you think?
Dr. Bart Ehrman, right?
I
mean, he's one of the scholars and those that have followed his work who want to say that, hey, look, if there's anything that we can say that's true about Jesus is that there was a figure who was crucified. Look at the esoteric elements surrounding that crucifixion, which you are keying on, and I look at the same thing that you have, but looking at it from the standpoint of gematria, the numerical value of the 6th hour is 1335. Oh, it's that miracle number again from Daniel. The 6th hour, 1335. There it is in Greek. He hung on the cross from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. The 9th hour is 1335. So the 6th hour and the 9th hour. And of course, we're talking about the 6th hour being 12 noon. It's the time when the sun is highest in the sky. In terms of the signs of the zodiac, we're talking about Cancer the Crab. Cancer the Crab is associated with Matthew. The conversion of Matthew the disciple is again associated with 1335 as the highest point that the sun is in the sky. It was at this same 6th hour that Jesus ministered to the woman of Samaria. You remember that story about the Samaritan woman? The numerical value of the woman at Samaria, 1335. Here we go again. Well, he met her at the 6th hour. The same thing. So
didn't she have 6 husbands too, or something? 5 husbands, or some crazy?
She had 6 husbands, which I've deconstructed, and I think this is what's going on with the 6 husbands, as far as I can tell. And one of the things it contributes to is this authorship of the Gospel of John and the Book of Revelation. I'm not saying they were composed by the same group or the same individual, but there are certain commonalities in the way they treat timelines, okay? This woman of Samaria had 6 husbands. She represented, Samaria means watchtower, and Samaria was the capital of Israel, just as Jerusalem was the capital of Judah. And the 6 husbands, you're thinking about it, and it's pretty obvious in the language when he says the one that you have right now is not your husband, that he's talking about nations. He's talking about people. He's not talking about husbands. Okay, so you had 6 husbands. Here are your 6 husbands. Israel had Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. Okay, you've had 5 husbands. That's what he says. You've had 5 husbands. And the one that you have now, at the time that gospel was written, which would be Rome, is not your husband. Okay, so who is the husband? The husband is the Messiah. The husband is this 7th man that comes on the scene. But what's important there is that story of the woman at Samaria is tracing the entire history of Israel. And you know this is the case because when Jesus is crucified, what is it that the Jews say? They say, we have no king but Caesar. That's a vow to marriage. It's saying we're not married to anybody but Caesar, which brings up the case that I'm making in John chapter 4, that the woman at Samaria is talking about marriage here, and it's talking about the relationship of Israel to all of the nations who have conquered her over the centuries. So there's so much more here than meets the eye. But to get back to your original question and your original issue, I have learned the most in this project from constructing a timeline. I've learned the most, and I'd like for us to go through that timeline because it's very interesting, and I
Do
think
you really want
the
to
listener.
release that information? I'm just kidding. Go ahead, because people are
Well,
going to see
well,
an exhaustive form of it.
the time, yeah, and the timeline is more or less common knowledge. How I've assembled it is what's unique, but nonetheless, the timeline is there, and we want to talk about it because, first of all, a timeline will allow you to put things into perspective and allow and necessitate that you fill in all the gaps. We can talk about history, we can miss hundreds of years, we can miss important developments, but when you do a timeline, you actually see what led to what in terms of causes and motivations. So yes, I'd like to talk a little bit about that, if I may. The point that I'm making is it's possible to construct, as I have done, a Christianity timeline without Christ. You can do a timeline of Jesus without Jesus. Now, how do you figure that? He's supposed to be the central figure of Christianity. And you notice in the timeline that you really don't need a Jesus to construct a Christian timeline. So one of the things that I noticed in this is, okay, how do you reconcile the gospel accounts of the historicity of Jesus? You know, Matthew says he was born in 4 CE. 4 BC, which was the year that Herod died. Yeah, 4 BC. Luke says, hey, it was during the time of the census of Quirinius, which would be 6 CE. All right. In the timeline, I talk about the importance of the death of Herod Agrippa to the development of Christianity. In fact, I have, and I'm not going to say when, you have to buy the book in order to find out. But as far as I'm concerned, Christianity was invented in earnest in direct relation to this, in direct relation to the demise of Herod. So, I mean, look at this. Matthew is saying one thing, Luke is saying something else. Scholars are debating the issue. But if you look at it, okay, when this Jesus character arises, have you noticed that it's always in connection with the demise or the deposing of a Herodian figure? Have you noticed that? He was born in 4 CE and 4 BC, says Matthew. Well, that's the year that Herod the Great died, right? Are you with me, Derek?
Oh, I'm with you. I'm
okay.
paying attention.
All right. He says, or Matthew says, Jesus was born in 4 BC. That's when Herod the Great dies. Luke says, nah, he was born in 6 CE. Well, guess what? That's when Herod Archelaus was deposed. He got a vote of no confidence from Rome and he got taken away, booted off of his kingdom. Okay. Christianity began in earnest if you look at a timeline involving the book of Acts. In 44 AD, what happened then? That was the death of Herod Agrippa. In 44 AD. So we have the emergence of the Christ figure always, always, always in connection with the death or deposing of a Herodian figure. Why is that? Herod was acknowledged, Herod the Great, and then later as his title was subsumed by Herod Agrippa, his son, as the king of the Jews. Jesus is the king of the Jews. And one of the things I propose in this book is that Jesus was introduced by Jews and particularly by pro-Roman factions as the new Herod. And that is what these accounts all have in common. Herod that could
better. Right.
Well, yeah, it was better than original Herod because he couldn't be corrupted, because a mythological figure is always easier to manipulate than an actual historical figure. So we have details such as Herod being buried in a purple robe. Okay, the Gospel of Mark, which is recognized as the first gospel, the primordial gospel. What does it have Jesus wearing at the time of crucifixion? A purple robe. Being called the King of the Jews. There are many, many examples of this. And so we often get from scholars of one stripe or another, Chris Lawson, Professor Robert Eisenman, there are those that believe that, okay, Jesus, if there was a Jesus, he was a militant messianic figure. We have others who want to say that Well, Jesus was really a pro-Roman figure. You look at how he's treated in the New Testament. You look at the writings associated with him. The fact that he advocated the payment of taxes, the fact that he says walk 2 miles in carrying the burden of a Roman soldier and so forth. So no, he was a pro-Roman figure. The answer, he was both. He was a reconciliation of the anti-Roman forces and the pro-Roman forces in Israel. And that is what explains him. It's what explains him in terms of the sun, S-U-N-S-O-N, that goes around the entire zodiac, not just the pro-Roman side, but the anti-Roman side. And he was the resolution of the pro-Roman and anti-Roman figures. In other words, Jesus wasn't just blindly contrived to say, oh, well, we need a pro-Roman savior. No, he was one that was done sensitively in recognition of the prevailing anti-Roman forces that were there, and he resolved them into a figure that was acceptable for the new religion and for the Roman Empire.
Dr. Luther, this is a wonderful, wonderful show that we just did. A good teaser on the book. You gave him a little bit of inside peek to a lot of this stuff, but there's so much more that you haven't even told me. And there's things that I know that you've mentioned that I can't even mention. So this book is a must get. How can people help you? What can they do to help you and support what you're doing?
I'm grateful for what those have already done. I've already had donations, both large and small. Someone donated a not inconsiderable amount via my PayPal, but also I've got PayPal, if you'll put that on the screen, and my Patreon. I'm very grateful for whatever gift. And this is what I pledge to do. If you contribute any amount to the writing of this book, you will receive mention and acknowledgement in the book itself. I'm very eager to do that. I appreciate all of the well wishes and the things that people have said in my absence on the show, and I'm very grateful. Can't wait to talk about more, but I don't want to spoil what's in the book.
So, ladies and gentlemen, his Patreon and PayPal will be down in the description of this video, and you guys can click the links there if you want to join his Patreon. How much is it to join your Patreon?
We've got a graduated tier you can find on that. It's as little as $5, but then you go right in and it gives you access to some more detailed writings, which all have a bearing on the book, even though obviously the book is not yet on that Patreon. But you have levels of membership. And we invite you, to the extent that you're interested in this material, by all means, do subscribe to that Patreon.
And then you can, of course, get him on the PayPal, which is a one-time donation. You guys can help him out, give him some shekels. You know, the tax collector Luther here deserves it. And, you know, if you're not tithing anymore in church like I don't, I guess it's a fair game to go ahead and give someone who's doing what he's doing 10% for one time, you know? So, Luther, yeah. And by the way, if you can't leave a message that you're donating toward the cause, you might want to find him on Facebook Messenger. If you're not on Facebook, you can email him. Is that email available?
Yes, it is. And Derek, the email is all lowercase, Luther G. Williams, PhD @gmail.com. One more time, Luther G. Williams, run that all together, PhD @gmail.com.
I'll stick that down in the description as well. Thank you for joining me on this, brother. We are Myth Vision. Now it's your turn. You got to say it. Say it like you mean it, brother.
I'm never going to forget it. And thanks for affording me the opportunity. It's like old times, Derek. Well, let's see. Here we go. We are Myth Vision.